So I'm joined this evening by Michael Carroll, who is a writer in the Comic Zone based in Dublin. And he's kindly agreed to talk us through some of the regular or familiar or unfamiliar vintage comics that were, I suppose, bought and read and devoured in Ireland some seasons ago. Michael, you're very welcome and thank you for being involved in the Ballinasloe Library Comic-Con second edition.
It's lovely to be here. I love what you've done with the place. Oh wait, we're virtual. This is my house. I knew it was familiar.
We're doing our best. It's all in the power of the imagination, thanks to technology. So a lot of folks here in town remember Dandies and Twinkles and Curly Wee and Gussie Goose, and we originally hoped to be able to collect a lot of these manuscripts and comics from members of the active retirement community and elsewhere. But COVID has done a lot of decluttering in houses, and a lot of people have either sent it to the archive in the attic and can't find the stuff, or have horribly skipped them. But you, in your wisdom, have a couple of wonderful memories from comics from yesteryear, and you're going to talk us through them, where they grew out of, who they were aimed for, and what genre they belonged to. The first being the adventure picture paper of Billy the Kid.
Yeah, that's a comic called Sun. Though that's one of the ones that had changed its name. They did that a lot in the early days. I said the early days. It ran from 47 to 59, and cowboys were huge back then because of the movies and all that sort of stuff. I mean, cowboys in real life only lasted for 3 or 4 years before they were sort of superseded by trains. But in the comics, they were amazing. His Son started out as a comic for like little kids, adventure stories, and it was like an 8-page thing where they have a couple of 1-page strips and a few little one-off cartoons and then a lot of text stories, where basically just a wall of very dense text, the adventures of kids who are detectives, that kind of thing. But cowboys became popular, so they changed the name of Sun eventually to the Cowboy Sun, and they changed it a few more times since. But they featured Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, and these kind of fantasized versions of real cowboys, and they were hugely popular. My dad was born in 1940, so he would have grown up reading Sun as one of the comics he would have read, and he clearly remembers a lot of the characters, but doesn't necessarily remember the comics they were in. But yeah, he was a big into that in a huge way. And yeah, cowboy comics you don't get them at all now. It's apart from the fact that we know now that they were terribly racist and offensive, but they were huge. When I was growing up in the 70s, there was still a few cowboy stories that appear here and there in comics like The Victor and Hotspur and things like that. But even by then, they were on the way out, being replaced by war stories and science fiction. But,
so I guess this was a typical story of where the movies or the cinema reels or the flicks, as they might have been called in some locations, of the 40s and 50s reflected back in the comic genre of what was on the big screen, ended up what youngsters wanted to read.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the comics then would follow the trends, and Sun or the Bill the Kid comic as out there, it was absolutely a trend follower. I mean, they changed their name. Like I think at one stage in space of a year, they changed the name 4 times, just tweaking it, trying to catch a new audience. And there were some great tricks that the publishers used to do. The most of our comics came from the UK, where they had no scruples, as well we know. But they would do things like there was one publisher who would always start the comics at number 50 instead of number 1, because a reader coming along would say, "Oh, 50, number 50. This one's been around a while. It must be good." I mean, it's a terrible trick when you think about it, but it worked. And the kids would read the comics for a couple of years, and it's not like these days, whereas people like me who are well into their very late 20s. I'm 55, and I'm still reading them. The reading age was, or the reading range was sort of 5 or 6 years maybe, and you'd move from one comic to another. So what some publishers would do was after about 8 or 9 years, they'd start reprinting the older stuff because they figured no one would remember, and people didn't keep their comics in the same way. So they just basically they mined their own past for material, and it
Of
worked.
course. Michael, I'm fascinated for the younger viewer at this Comic-Con. For 3D is the subscription price or the purchase price of the
Oh
comic.
yeah.
Can I was a post-decimal baby. I suspect you were too, but your dad, growing up in the 40s, would have known what a 3D was. Would you explain to readers what a 3D?
Yeah. Oh no, we are delving back into the ancient past now. I do remember the old money because it
Okay.
changed, I think, in 1971 or 70. But I remember learning the old money. There was oh, this is hard. There was, I think it was 12 pennies in a shilling and then 20 shillings
In a
in
pound.
a pound. Yeah. But when they changed the decimal, there was only 5 pennies in a shilling. So I remember thinking, oh, hang on now, wait, it used to be 12. 12 is bigger than 5. Something's gone wrong here. I'm being ripped off. And that's a feeling that's never left me. I
So we're
all those
moving
penny
on.
chews we used to get.
Moving on to the second selection, Dan Dare, the pilot of the future.
Oh yeah.
We're into the earliest, I suppose, precepts of the science fiction and the intergalactic chapters
Yeah.
that followed. Why did you select this one, and what's so significant about
Yeah,
the way
Eagle
it
is
was made?
probably the most. Yeah, Eagle is probably the most influential British comic. Certainly of its time, it was hugely successful, and it came out in 1950, and it just blew everything out of the water in terms of production quality. And it was created by a fellow called the Reverend Marcus Morris. And Reverend wasn't just a coincidence; he actually was a priestly type person. He 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 was sickened with a lot of the American import comics that were very violent and horror based. He wanted something a bit more wholesome and more acceptable to families. So he created the Eagle comic, and the lead character was Dan Dare, who is in one form or another has been revived many times over the years. And Dan Dare was he was a space captain, but you have to remember this is 1950s version of the future. So we're looking at it now through very, very different eyes. So basically they saw it as the RAF in space. And it really was stiff upper lips all over the place. And tremendously well-drawn stories, very imaginative tales, and really, really was top quality stuff. And even now, the tales still they still stand up really well. They're a little bit Biggles kind of thing, a very stiff upper lippy, as I say, and what ho chaps and so on. But for older, younger readers wouldn't get it, I think. But for older readers who got the nostalgia thing, it's good. And Eagle was
Would it be correct to
massively
say,
successful.
Michael, that the early Flash Gordon into Dan Dare were only orientated towards the young boys? That there wasn't really an
Yeah.
appreciation that
Oh
female
yeah, yeah.
readers would be interested in science fiction or intergalactic or space wars.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, even though science fiction was created by a woman, because the first proper real science fiction book was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, where the science is behind the story rather than magic or something like that, or supernatural. So science fiction created by a woman. So anybody who thinks it's only for boys is very much mistaken. But yeah, Dan Dare, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and all that. It was designed. These comics were aimed at boys. There were some comics that were aimed at girls. There was a girl version of Eagle released the following year, and they didn't come up with a good title. They called it Girl. I mean, that's really plumbing the very shallow depths of the imagination there. What can we call this one? With the girls comic, we'll call it Girl. Brilliant. And they all went home half day there.
Very good.
So yeah, the comics were very much segregated after the nursery age. Well, once you're about beyond 5 or 6, there were girls comics, boys comics, and I remember being in the 70s being beaten up in school because I mentioned that I'd read one of my sister's comics. So this was like an absolute no. To be honest, that didn't stop me. I still read them all. I read everything that came into the house.
Moving to your third selection, Smash. Now this one caught me by surprise because I couldn't recall Smash at all.
Yeah, Smash was printed in the, I don't know, I have the details here, in the 60s. So
Right.
it's actually slightly older than me. Yes, I picked Smash as one of the ones here because it's one that a lot of people mightn't remember so well, but it was the comic creators of today, especially people my sort of age and a little older, really do remember this one. It was very anarchic and very clever for its time. It was just mostly madcap, crazy, inventive stuff. Where they kind of said, no holds barred, let's go mad. But it was still very much aimed at kids, and they were very clever, and for the time, very modern stories. Plus, what they did was it's about Smash and similar comics of the era, like Wham and Fantastic and so on. They reprinted a lot of American strips, so that's where we first saw things like Batman and the Hulk and things like that, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, as well as their own homegrown stuff.
The front cover, I don't know why, it reminds me of some of the strips from the Dandy, but perhaps there was an overlap
Yeah.
of writers or
Yeah, there's
cartoonists
definitely an overlap of the artists, and yeah, people like Leo Baxendale, who was an absolute comic genius, and Ken Reed and people like that. They all worked for Smash, and I mean, I can't remember. I'm not very good at picking out artists from their styles, but I just know what they did. Yeah, it was very, Smash was definitely trying to be of the Beano/Dandy variety, but in a then more modern sensibility. So it was tremendously good fun, and one of those comics, as I say, had an impact that really lasted, but it didn't really land in the zeitgeist. The average person wouldn't necessarily know what it was, but those of us in the business, we know it made a huge impact. Great
Very
comic.
good. And your next selection obviously appeals or would have appealed to a more mature Twinkle reader, I suspect. Marilyn,
Yeah.
Fourpence.
Yeah, no, Marilyn was interesting because something that's really gone now completely is in the 50s and 60s, there were comics aimed at older women. And I say older women, I don't mean in the 50s, but people who were not schoolgirls. They were young women who were working. Some of them were even young married mothers, that kind of thing. And the comics were romance titles that they were designed to capture that market. And Marilyn was obviously named after Marilyn Monroe, or at least in deference to her. And
Yes.
the comics were all about, young women finding love. I mean, they were very tame by later standards. Nothing more exciting than a kiss or holding hands. But then again, when you get to my sort of age, that's just as exciting anyway. So they were actually surprisingly, for the most part, surprisingly good. You might think they were kind of twee and a little bit soppy, but some of them were pretty sharp. A lot of them are things that we wouldn't identify with now, but they were interesting. And when I as an archivist, I'm looking back at a lot of this stuff, thinking I won't bother reading these. But then I start turning the pages and getting captured by them, and some of them are really clever. I think it's a shame they kind of died out when technology improved and we were able to get photo romance magazines. So things like My Guy and Photo Love and all that sort of stuff. They came in, so they replaced all the hand-drawn stories with photo stories, and that kind of changed the market a bit. But for the time, things like Marilyn were very successful, and I mean, some of these comics back in the day, people don't realize it. These days, if a comic sells 100,000 copies, it's phenomenal. But the Eagle, for example, issue 1 sold over 1 million copies. Marilyn would have sold well over 200,000 copies per issue. And these were just, I mean, at one stage in the 50s, I think there was like 200 different weekly comics.
Wow.
And people just, parted with them. And
1958, I think, is the year of the particular one that you selected for us. So late 50s. The artwork in them reminds me of there was various sort of adult strips, but not in that meaning of the word, but boy meets girl meets boy, partners in trouble in the tabloids in the 80s and 70s, and a lot of that stylized artwork would have been recreated in those strips. So maybe they morphed into that section of the Red Tops.
Yeah, to a degree. Yeah,
the 70s.
that's one place where they survived. In the strips like George and Lynn and all that.
Yeah.
One of those. I mean, to be honest, I despise them, but those ones I don't. I like the comics. I didn't like the those newspaper strips. They were tatty, but yeah. But so some of the artists just carried on, and they went where the work was. And that's the way it was. I mean, unfortunately, one thing that's really tragic, I think, is that an awful lot of these publishers, they refused to name the writers and artists. So for some of them, we still don't know who drew or wrote what. And there was no royalties in those days. They got paid a flat fee. So if the stuff was reprinted, they never got paid again. These days, it's
I suppose for younger viewers of this program and participating in the Comic-Con, the reality of growing up as a young boy or girl in the 40s or 50s, you know, a lot would have finished with their formal schooling at 14 or 15 years of age. So their reading skills may not be as polished as our reading skills of a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old today. So I suppose these comics were a key part of their later teen educational process, because they were able to read a small sentence and to dip in and dip out of shorter stories that had visual prompts in a way that a novel or a biography would have switched them off.
Right. If we go back to the early days, just before comics really took off, there was the story papers, which were the same kind of publication, but they were dense with text and they were very, very popular as well. And people were more widely read then, and they would have left school at 12, 13, 14. The story papers would have had 10 to 15,000 words per issue, maybe even more than that, maybe up to 30.
The Illustrated London News, I suppose, was the granddaddy of all them.
Things like the Rover and Adventure and things like that. So they were adventure type stories. So they were what eventually became comics, but they had a very dense text, and some of them were very complex stories as well. Now I'm not saying they were very good. Some of them were atrocious, and some of them were just the same stories repeated over and over. But like the most prolific writer that we know of ever in English language is a guy called Franklin Richards, who wrote Billy Bunter and things like that. And there were he turned out, I don't know, it's something like 200 million words of stuff in his lifetime. He just wrote tons and tons and tons of stuff. I don't know the actual figures, that could be way off.
Huge output.
Yeah.
But he had an audience clearly
comics, comics were kind of in the 60s. Maybe I'd say they were dumbed down a little bit, but in terms of the reading age, I don't know. I think people were better read in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that up to the early start of the 60s, and then faded a little. But I think
with the advent of TV,
people assume that because comics are short that they have that they're juvenile. But
I wouldn't assume that, no. But
it's a mistake a lot of people make, and it's that's like saying that television is only for people who want to see Coronation Street or who only want to watch Magic Roundabout.
Your final selection right here is a wonderful film family favorite of most households, The Beano. Tell us where it came out of and why it still holds a special place in a lot of hearts.
Well, the Beano came up in, I think it was 1938. I think it was launched, and it's been going. It's still going. It's the longest running British comic by far at this stage. I mean, the Beano came out the same year that Superman did. So it's, if we think about it, the first people who read this didn't know what World War II was, because World War II didn't start for another year. It's still going strong. It's still got some of the same characters from the early days as well. I think Biffo the bear crops up every now and again, but its star character is still Dennis the Menace in the Beano, who is Dennis is brilliant. Though when I was a kid, Dennis was the bully of the stories, and now he's kind of an anti-hero in a way. He's not as naughty as he used to be. He used to get the slipper. Younger people won't remember getting the slipper, or in our case, the wooden spoon, because you're not allowed to hit children anymore, apparently, in any state. But the Beano has been going since 1938, and it's only ever slowed down. I think it was during the Second World War when they used to take turns with the dandy, because they paper shortages. They couldn't print them all at the same time, and it's still going great. And unfortunately, the Dandy sadly passed away at the age of 75, but the Beano has been going for 83 years, which is just amazing. So, yeah.
When you look back at all the vintage comics that you've read and that you've seen and that you've had the privilege of collecting, do you think the future is bright for comics in Ireland, in the world?
I think it is, yeah. In the past few years in particular, there's been an awful lot of Irish comic creators have appeared. And what we're people like myself and others, but there's also, it's easier now to create your own comics. You can publish them online for next to nothing, or there's actual, proper physical editions you can get. If the technology is there, it's also much easier to find co-creators. And I mean, there's people like Ed Doyle, who lives down in Wexford, who's creating his own comics, and actually I could name thousands. Anthea West is a friend of mine who creates her own comics. There's Leanne Hamilton. There's lots of Irish comic creators, and they're doing what they want to do, and sometimes it's based on stuff they've read or stuff they've just created solely out of their own imaginations, or they're working with other publishers. I work with 2000 AD, and I write Judge Dredd and things like that. I think the future is very bright, but comics are changing, and the market isn't really there for the younger kids as much as it used to be. And that's a bit of a shame, because that's where the readers of the future come from. So there's a lot of stuff aimed at older people. But there's the Phoenix is still going on, and that's it for kids. Beano is still out there. So it's still it's not as vibrant as it used to be. As I say, back in the heyday, it was comics used to sell 250,000 copies a week, and if they dropped below that figure, they'd be cancelled. And now, if you get 10,000 copies a week, it's amazing. So,
and just before I let you go, I think was it you or was it one of your colleagues that was telling me about the provenance of a lot of the American comics that came in the 30s, 40s, and 50s because they were used for something in the shipping trade. Just remind me of that story.
Yeah, back in the I think it was before the Second World War, or maybe say during, but a lot of comics came from America to Ireland and the UK. Well, they came into Belfast basically, so they're introduced, but they would come over in the ships as ballast to so basically stored way down the hold, just big bundles of comics magazines, the pulp fiction books that weren't necessarily officially published here ended up here because they would have been just scrapped over there, but you shipped them over as ballast, and then when they got here, they were offloaded, and people would say, "Oh, great, we're having these," and they would sell them. So you can still find, early edition of American comics and books and magazines because of that, and that's how a lot of Irish writers and artists and so on got their start, from looking at stuff like that.
Michael, this has been a fascinating insight in the short compressed period of time.
We've barely started.
I know, but I mean, this was just a smorgasbord or a little potpourri for the uninitiated, to give them a flavor of what is out there in our attics, in our libraries, in our nannies and granddads' sheds. And there is a treasure trove of stuff in a lot of houses.
Yeah, if there's something that you find, any old magazines or old comics, don't throw them away. Give them to me, and I'll throw them away for you. Yeah.
And hopefully next year when we do the Comic-Con again, we might get some more people in the locale who might share with us their early childhood memories of some comics that are particularly dear to them, that they may have bought in Connolly's, or may have bought in Rosa Keane's, or in the Salmons, or different newsagents in town. But Michael, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for this, and we look forward to engaging with you in Comic-Con 2022. And thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Colin. Thank you.